The end of the fairy tale didn't happen with a public explosion or a scandalous headline. It didn't happen on a balcony in front of cheering crowds. Nor did it happen during a state banquet under the glare of 1,000 camera flashes. It began in a moment of terrifying, suffocating silence inside the walls of Adelaide Cottage, 5 minutes before the world would change forever. It began with a single conversation in the late afternoon, an unguarded moment when Princess Catherine's carefully maintained composure finally cracked after 20 years of holding everything together. The winter light was filtering weakly through the high windows of her private study, casting long, gray shadows across the room that matched the mood of the woman sitting there. To the outside world, she was the pillar of the monarchy, the unwavering symbol of grace and duty. But in this room, stripped of the cameras and the crowds, she was simply a woman who had reached the absolute limit of her endurance. Catherine was sitting in her favorite armchair, but there was no relaxation in her posture. Her most trusted lady-in-waiting, Sophie Alderton, who had been by her side for 8 turbulent years, noticed immediately that something was profoundly, dangerously wrong. Catherine's hands were trembling violently as she tried to lift a cup of tea to her lips, a fine china cup rattling against its saucer, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. Her eyes, usually so bright and engaged, were red-rimmed and swollen, speaking of tears that had been shed in secret, away from the prying eyes of staff and family. Sophie had witnessed countless private moments. She had seen the exhaustion after long tours, the frustration with press intrusion, and the quiet sacrifices made for the crown. But she had never seen the princess like this. This wasn't just fatigue, it was a total collapse of spirit. It was the look of a soldier who realizes, in the heat of battle, that they can no longer lift their shield. The usual perfect posture that Catherine maintained like armor had collapsed into something resembling total defeat. The silence stretched, heavy and unbearable, until Catherine finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of 2 decades of suppressed emotion. "I can't do this anymore," she said, the words falling into the room like stones. Sophie froze. She knew better than to interrupt. She watched as the princess set the tea down, her hands shaking too much to hold it. Catherine looked up, her gaze piercing through the veil of royal protocol that usually governed their interactions. "I can't keep pretending that everything is fine," Catherine continued, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "I can't keep pretending that my marriage is some grand love story, that I am not slowly disappearing inside a role that was never meant for someone like me." The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking after years of immense pressure. She wasn't talking about the pressures of being the Princess of Wales. She was talking about something far more personal and far more devastating. She was talking about the suffocating loneliness of a marriage where duty had slowly, methodically strangled intimacy. She spoke of feeling like a beautiful accessory in Prince William's life, rather than a true partner, a prop to be wheeled out for photo opportunities and then stored away in the silence of separate rooms when the cameras stopped rolling. For years, the world had bought into the image of the perfect couple. But here, in the dim light of Adelaide Cottage, Catherine was dismantling that image brick by brick. She described a relationship that had transformed from genuine connection into something cold and transactional. Conversations between her and the future king no longer revolved around dreams, fears, or shared laughter. Instead, they were entirely consumed by schedules, duties, and public perception. She looked at Sophie, her eyes filled with a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air out of the room. "He treats me more like a royal employee than a wife," she confessed, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "I have spent years performing happiness while dying inside, and today I realized that the performance is over." At that moment, the porcelain perfection of the Wales family didn't just crack, it shattered. And unbeknownst to Catherine, this confession was about to set off a chain reaction that would tear Kensington Palace apart from the inside. The confession in the study didn't stop with a general admission of unhappiness. If it had, perhaps the palace could have contained it. But Catherine, emboldened by the sheer relief of speaking the truth, began to dissect the specific, agonizing timeline of her marriage's collapse. She pinpointed the exact moment the William she loved began to disappear, the day he became the Prince of Wales. It was as if the title came with a curse, she told Sophie, her voice gaining a trembling intensity. She described how the weight of his future responsibilities didn't just sit on his shoulders. It crushed the human part of him. The man who used to laugh with her, who used to share private jokes and stolen moments of affection, was slowly replaced by a strategist, a future monarch who viewed every interaction, even with his wife, through the lens of protocol and risk management. He consults me about the children's schedules. He consults me about charity patronages. But he never consults me about his thoughts, his fears, or his heart, Catherine revealed. She painted a picture of a man who treated his home not as a sanctuary, but as an extension of the office. In public, he performed the role of the attentive husband, perfectly placing a hand on her back, smiling at her jokes. But the moment the heavy oak doors of Adelaide Cottage closed, the warmth evaporated. He retreated into himself, into a fortress of silence where she was not allowed to enter. It was an emotional absence that left her feeling more isolated than if she had been living entirely alone. But the most damaging revelation, the one that Sophie Alderton knew would be explosive if it ever leaked, was about the nature of their intimacy. Catherine took a breath, a sound that shuddered in her chest, before speaking about the strangers they had become. She confirmed what the tabloids had only dared to whisper. They were living separate lives under the same roof. The physical and emotional passion that had defined their early years at St. Andrews, and even the early years of their marriage, had completely evaporated. We are co-parents to George, Charlotte, and Louis. We are co-performers in the royal pageant. But we are no longer lovers. We aren't even friends, she admitted, the brutality of the truth hanging in the air. She described the nights spent lying awake, staring at the ceiling of her separate bedroom, wondering how two people who had once promised to face the world together had ended up miles apart while sleeping down the hall from each other. She spoke of the suffocating grief of watching other couples, staff members, friends, even strangers in the park, displaying genuine, unguarded affection and realizing that she was starving for something she would likely never have again. Sophie sat in stunned silence, her tea forgotten and cold. She was listening to the future Queen of England describe a life of resigned sadness. It wasn't anger that drove Catherine's words, it was acceptance, an acceptance that she had trapped herself in a golden cage, bound by duty, by her love for her children, and by a sense of responsibility to an institution that was slowly erasing her identity. I was a confident young woman when I entered this family, Catherine said, looking at a photo of her younger self on the desk. Now, I look in the mirror and I see a script, a perfectly styled, perfectly behaved version of myself that has nothing to do with who I really am. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. It was a purging of the soul, a desperate attempt to be seen as a human being rather than a figurehead. Sophie offered no advice. What advice could you give to a woman whose marriage is a matter of state security? Instead, she simply witnessed the pain. But as Catherine fell silent, exhausted by the emotional toll of her confession, the atmosphere in the room shifted from tragedy to danger, because secrets of this magnitude have a weight of their own, and in the royal world, knowledge is power. The tragedy of Princess Catherine isn't just that she was unhappy. It is that she was naive enough to believe that in the viper's nest of the monarchy, she could still afford the luxury of trust. When the conversation in the study finally ended, the room felt lighter, purged of the secrets that had been poisoning the air for years. Catherine looked at Sophie Alderton, the woman who had held her hand through pregnancies, through press scandals, and through the darkest days of her cancer treatment, and saw a savior. She believed she had found a sanctuary. But the moment Sophie stepped out of Adelaide Cottage and into the crisp evening air, the dynamic shifted from friendship to liability. Sophie didn't go straight home. She sat in her car, the engine idling, her mind racing with the enormity of what she had just heard. The future Queen of England had just declared her marriage dead. This wasn't gossip. This was history in the making, and in a moment of catastrophic judgment, Sophie made a decision that would seal her fate and doom Catherine's privacy. She pulled out her phone. Her thumbs hovered over the screen, Later, she would claim her intentions were protective, that she wanted to document the princess's exact words to safeguard them against future revisionism or gaslighting by the palace machinery. It is a common defense in the royal household. Record everything to protect yourself. But intent rarely matters when the outcome is treason. Sophie began to type. She transcribed the raw agony of Catherine's confession. The trembling hands, the transactional marriage, the separate bedrooms, the specific phrase dying inside. She locked these notes in a digital file, believing she was creating a safety net. But digital secrets are like water. They always find a way to leak. The breach didn't happen through a sophisticated hack or a stolen device. It happened through human error and familiar ambition. Within 3 hours, Sophie's secure notes had been seen by her sister, a sharp-elbowed executive at a major London public relations firm. The sister, whose entire career was built on spinning narratives and trading favors, didn't see a tragedy. She saw a gold mine. Recognizing the radioactive nature of the material, the sister didn't go directly to the press that would be too crude, too traceable. Instead, she shared the information with a trusted colleague, a euphemism for a broker of information. This colleague understood exactly how the game was played. They didn't sell the story immediately. They floated it. They made carefully worded inquiries to top-tier royal correspondents, hinting that a significant development regarding the Wales marriage was imminent. By early evening, the whispers began to circulate in the invisible arteries of London's media ecosystem. Phones started buzzing in newsrooms from Fleet Street to Canary Wharf. The text messages were cryptic, but terrifyingly specific. Source close to AC says it's over. She used the word lonely. Check your sources on the separation. Infract. At Kensington Palace, the quiet Saturday routine was shattered. The press office, usually a fortress of calm control, suddenly lit up with incoming queries. These weren't the usual tabloid rumors about fashion or feuds. These were detailed questions about a specific conversation that had happened only hours ago inside a private residence. Senior palace aides froze. They realized with dawning horror that the perimeter had been breached. The information was too accurate, too fresh. This wasn't speculation. It was a live feed from inside the princess's private life. Emergency protocols were activated. Security teams were alerted to review digital footprints. The men in gray suits, the shadowy figures who really run the institution, were summoned from their weekend retreats. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Catherine had spoken, and somehow the world was about to hear every word. The betrayal was complete. The sanctuary of Adelaide Cottage had been violated, not by an enemy, but by the very system designed to serve it. And as the sun set over London, the machinery of the palace began to grind into gear, not to save Catherine's happiness, but to silence her truth before it could burn the monarchy to the ground. While Catherine's secrets were spreading like a virus through the digital veins of London, Prince William was doing exactly what he had been bred to do since birth, performing. He was attending a charitable engagement in East London, shaking hands, nodding at the right moments, and projecting the impeccable image of the steady, stoic heir. The cameras clicked, capturing a man who looked entirely in control of his destiny. But that control was an illusion that was about to be violently shattered. The moment the thread snapped didn't happen in front of the press. It happened in a quiet corridor, away from the public gaze. His private secretary approached him, face pale and posture rigid. In the unspoken language of the palace, William knew immediately. This wasn't a schedule change. This was a catastrophe. William excused himself, his smile vanishing the second he turned his back on the crowd. He was ushered into a secure room, a sterile space designed for private calls. But nothing could have prepared him for the briefing he was about to receive. As the aide outlined the situation that Catherine had reportedly confessed to the collapse of their marriage and that the details were leaking, William's initial reaction was not anger. It was a reflex of pure denial. "Impossible," he said, his voice clipped. "Catherine is discreet. She knows the rules. This is just noise." For a few minutes, he clung to that belief. He told himself these were rumors without foundation, the kind of garbage the tabloids invented on slow news days. Catherine, the woman who had never put a foot wrong in 20 years, would never betray their family privacy. She would never hand their enemies the ammunition to destroy them. But then, the secretary began to read the specific phrases circulating among the press brokers. A transactional marriage. Dying inside. A beautiful accessory. The color drained from William's face. These weren't the generic fabrications of a gossip columnist. These were phrases that echoed the silence of his own home. They sounded unmistakably like Catherine's internal monologue, the words he had seen in her eyes but refused to acknowledge. Denial collapsed. In its place, a cold, incandescent fury took hold. Decades of training in emotional suppression were momentarily abandoned. William paced the small room, a caged animal realizing the lock had been picked. How could she? How could she expose their private struggles to people who would inevitably exploit them? Did she not understand the damage this would cause, not just to him personally, but to the institution of the monarchy, and, most unforgivably, to their children? He felt a profound sense of betrayal. He viewed their silence not as a burden, but as a necessary shield. By lowering that shield, Catherine hadn't just hurt him, she had endangered the crown. But beneath the rage, there was something sharper, something more painful that he couldn't quite suppress. Recognition. The fury was a defense mechanism. Deep down, the future king knew that the leaked revelations, however damaging, were not fundamentally untrue. He had become distant. He had prioritized duty over intimacy. He had treated their marriage as a partnership of state, rather than a union of souls. Hearing his wife's pain described so starkly by a third party forced him to confront the emotional costs he had been determinedly ignoring for years. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The perfect life he thought he was leading was a lie, and his wife had just stopped playing her part. William made a snap decision. He canceled the remainder of the day's engagements, a rare move that would signal to the press pack that something was wrong, but he no longer cared about optics. He needed to get home. He walked out to his waiting Land Rover, his face a mask of thunder. The drive back to Windsor was a blur of speed and silence. He wasn't just returning to a wife, he was returning to a confrontation that had been 20 years in the making. The prince was gone. The angry, wounded husband was coming home, and he was bringing the storm with him. When Prince William's Range Rover crunched across the gravel driveway of Adelaide Cottage, the sound was aggressive, mirroring the mood of the man behind the wheel. The security detail, sensing the radioactive tension radiating from the future king, stayed back. William didn't wait for doors to be opened. He stormed into the house, bringing the cold winter air in with him. He found Catherine exactly where Sophie Alderton had left her hours earlier, sitting in her study, looking small and fragile against the darkening window. But as William entered the room, slamming the heavy oak door behind him with a force that rattled the frames, he didn't see her fragility. He only saw the catastrophe she had unleashed. The silence that followed was suffocating. William stood there, his chest heaving, his face flushed with a mixture of exertion and barely controlled fury. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet, trembling with the effort to keep from shouting. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" he asked, the words cutting through the room like a knife. "Do you have any concept of the fire you have just started?" He didn't wait for an answer. He began to pace, listing the reports his team was receiving, the leaks, the specific phrases, the humiliation of having their private lives dissected by strangers. He accused her of recklessness, of selfishness, of placing her own emotional needs above the stability of the crown and the future of their children. "We have rules, Catherine," he snapped. "We have survived because we do not speak, we do not complain. And in one afternoon, you have handed our enemies the weapon they have been waiting for." For a moment, it seemed like Catherine would crumble. She looked down at her hands, still resting on her lap. But then, something shifted. The perfect princess, who had spent 20 years smiling through the pain, nodding at instructions, and swallowing her pride, suddenly vanished. Catherine raised her head. Her eyes were dry, and her gaze was steady. "You want to know what I said?" she replied, her voice soft but unyielding. "I told the truth, William. I told someone how lonely I am, how empty this house feels even when you are in it." William stopped pacing. He looked at her, stunned by the defiance in her tone. "I am tired of performing," she continued, standing up to meet his gaze. "I am tired of protecting your image, protecting the institution, protecting everyone's feelings while my own are completely ignored. I am dying inside this marriage, and you haven't even noticed because you're too busy being the Prince of Wales." The argument that followed was brutal and revealing. It was the kind of fight that only happens when two people have been suppressing the truth for decades. The veneer of royal politeness was stripped away. Years of resentments erupted into the open air. William accused her of disloyalty. Catherine countered that she had sacrificed her entire identity for his family. They fought about his distance, his controlling nature, the way he made decisions without consulting her. They fought about the separate bedrooms and the coldness that had seeped into their lives like damp rot. "I am not your employee, William." Catherine's voice finally rose, cracking with emotion. "I am your wife, but you treat me like a scheduled appointment." At some point during the confrontation, the anger in the room peaked and then collapsed into something closer to despair. William, running a hand through his hair in frustration, sat heavily in a chair opposite her. He looked at the woman he had married, really looked at her, and realized that his anger was futile, because she was right. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy with threat. It was heavy with grief. They were two people trapped in a golden cage, screaming at each other through the bars. And outside the window, the night had fully fallen, bringing with it the inevitable storm of public scrutiny that was about to break over their heads. The screaming in the study had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was far heavier. It was the silence of a house where the foundation had cracked, and everyone inside was holding their breath, waiting for the roof to fall. Amidst the crisis management and the panic over press leaks, one terrifying thought dominated the minds of both William and Catherine: the children. For 20 years, they had built a fortress around George, Charlotte, and Louis. They had tried desperately to give them the normalcy that William never had a childhood free from the toxicity of the War of the Waleses that had destroyed his own parents. But as they walked up the stairs to the nursery floor, William and Catherine realized with sickening clarity that history wasn't just repeating itself, it was hunting them down. They knew they couldn't wait. George, at 11 years old, was no longer a toddler shielded by nanny protocols. He was intelligent, sensitive, and dangerously perceptive. If he didn't hear the truth from his parents tonight, he would hear a twisted version of it on the playground, or worse, see it on a newsstand. The conversation took place in George's bedroom. It was a scene that would break any parent's heart, but for the future king and queen, it carried the weight of the monarchy's survival. William and Catherine sat on the edge of the bed. They didn't speak as royals. They spoke as a mother and father who had failed to keep their most important promise. They explained, in careful, age-appropriate language, that Mommy and Daddy were facing challenges, that the atmosphere in the house had been difficult because they were hurting. But children have a way of cutting through euphemisms to the terrifying truth beneath. George looked at them, his eyes wide with a fear he had clearly been holding inside for weeks. He didn't ask about duty or protocols. He asked the only thing that mattered to a child. "Are you getting divorced? Is our family going to fall apart?" The question hung in the air, echoing the ghosts of William's own childhood trauma. It was the exact question William had once asked Diana. William and Catherine answered quickly, perhaps too quickly. "No," they said. They promised they still loved each other. They promised the family would stay together. But even as the words left their mouths, they felt the hollowness of the reassurance. They were offering promises that were no longer entirely within their power to keep. The reactions of the children were a devastating mirror of the family's fractured state. Princess Charlotte, always the emotional barometer of the family, didn't ask questions. She simply broke down. She climbed into Catherine's lap, burying her face in her mother's chest, weeping with a raw, instinctive grief. She needed physical reassurance that her world wasn't ending. Catherine held her daughter tightly, whispering comforts, while her own tears fell silently into Charlotte's hair. Little Louis, too young to grasp the enormity of the moment, accepted the explanation and returned to his toys. His innocence was a mercy. but it was also a painful reminder of what his siblings had just lost. But it was George's reaction that worried William the most. After the initial question, the future king retreated into a careful composure. He stopped crying. He nodded. He internalized the pain, locking it away behind a mask of stoicism that looked frighteningly like his father's. At 11 years old, George was already learning the hardest lesson of royalty: how to suffer in silence. As William and Catherine left the room, leaving the door slightly ajar, they looked at each other. The anger from the study was gone, replaced by a shared, crushing guilt. They realized that no matter how the press handled the leaks tomorrow, the damage was already done. The fairy tale was over for the world, but the childhood innocence of the Wales children had ended tonight. While William and Catherine were upstairs, putting the pieces of their family back together, downstairs and across London in secure offices, the machinery of the monarchy was waking up in terror. Kensington Palace descended into what insiders call controlled chaos. The lights in the administrative wings burned late into the night. Sir Edward Hamilton, the prince's most senior aide, convened an emergency summit that would determine the fate of the Wales's public image. He pulled in communications directors, high-priced legal sharks, and the shadowy men in grey suits, whose job is to protect the crown at all costs. The atmosphere in the room was toxic. This wasn't a standard scandal. There were no illicit photos to suppress, no financial records to hide. This was something far more dangerous. The future queen consort had expressed a human emotion that contradicted the official narrative. "How do we spin loneliness?" one aide reportedly snapped during the meeting. "There is no playbook for this." The challenge was unprecedented. The team debated 3 strategies, each more desperate than the last. Strategy 1. Total denial. The initial instinct of the old guard was to issue a blistering statement, dismissing the leaks as fiction. They wanted to discredit the sources, paint Sophie Alderton as a liar, and claim the marriage was rock solid. But the younger strategists argued back. "We can't lie," they warned. "There are digital footprints. Sophie has notes. If we deny it, and the notes leak later, the prince looks like a liar, and the princess looks like a hostage." Denial was ruled out. It was too risky in the digital age. Strategy 2. The legal nuclear option. The lawyers scoured British privacy laws, looking for a way to slap injunctions on the media outlets preparing to run the story. They wanted to silence the press before the ink dried. But the reality of the law was cold. Catherine had shared this information voluntarily with a friend. Once that information was shared with a third party, the legal expectation of privacy evaporated. The lawyers had to deliver the crushing news to William's team. "We can't stop the presses. The story runs at midnight." Strategy 3. Managing the fall. This left them with the only option the palace hates: losing control. They had to accept that the story would break, and their only hope was to steer the wreckage. The debate in the war room turned to the Diana Echo. The older staff remembered the 1,990 seconds vividly, the War of the Waleses, the panorama interview, the way private misery became public entertainment. They were terrified that history was repeating itself. They analyzed how the British tabloids would frame it versus the broadsheets. The Sun would scream about a marriage in crisis. The Times would write thoughtful essays about the burden of duty, but the result would be the same. The illusion of the perfect family was dead. Social media presented a nightmare they couldn't control. They knew that within minutes of the story breaking, Twitter and TikTok would be flooded with speculation. Millions of eyes would be dissecting every previous interaction between William and Kate, looking for signs of the coldness Catherine had described. The palace realized they were fighting a 21st century information war with 20th century weapons. Meanwhile, the hunt for the source continued. Sophie Alderton was summoned. She wasn't brought to the war room. She was taken to a separate administrative office. There was no screaming there, just the icy professional termination of a life's work. She was confronted with the catastrophic breach of trust. She cried, apologizing profusely, insisting her intentions were to protect Catherine's words. But in the eyes of the palace, she was a liability that had to be neutralized. Her termination was discussed, but in a twist of cruel irony, They realized they couldn't fire her immediately. If they fired her tonight, she became a martyr. She might sell more secrets. So, they had to keep the traitor close, trapped in a limbo of silence. As the clock ticked toward the printing deadlines, the mood in the war room shifted from panic to a grim resignation. They realized that no amount of spin could fix this. The genie was out of the bottle. Sir Edward Hamilton looked at the draft statements on the table. Every option felt like a defeat. They were about to admit to the world that the future king and queen were human, flawed, and failing. And for an institution built on the divine right to rule, being human is the most dangerous thing of all. As the legal team in the war room admitted defeat, acknowledging that they could not stop the midnight presses, the focus shifted back to Adelaide Cottage. The atmosphere there had changed. The tears were gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Catherine sat across from William, who looked older than his years, the weight of the crown pressing down on him before he even wore it. He was terrified. To him, this leak was the beginning of another War of the Waleses, a repetition of the public mudslinging that had defined the 1,990 seconds. He wanted to hide. He wanted to issue a blanket denial and retreat behind the palace gates until the storm passed. But Catherine, showing the steel spine that had gotten her through 20 years of royal scrutiny, shook her head. "We cannot hide, William," she said quietly. "If we deny it, we look like liars. If we stay silent, we look like cowards. The world knows I said I was lonely. If we pretend I didn't, we insult their intelligence." She proposed something that initially horrified the traditionalists in the palace when it was relayed to them via secure line. She proposed owning the truth. "What if we don't spin it?" she asked. "What if we admit that this life is hard, that marriage is hard?" It was a radical gamble. For a century, the House of Windsor had survived by projecting an image of superhuman stoicism. Never complain, never explain was their religion. But Catherine realized that in the age of social media and radical transparency, stoicism looked like arrogance. Vulnerability, she argued, was their only path to survival. She suggested a controlled authenticity, not a tell-all interview like Diana's Panorama, which was designed to destroy, but a carefully managed acknowledgement of struggle. A statement that didn't deny the pain, but framed it as the cost of duty. William recoiled. To him, any public admission of marital struggle was a failure. It triggered his deepest trauma, the memory of his mother on television, discussing her bulimia and his father's infidelity. "We are not doing a soap opera," he snapped. "It's not a soap opera, William," Catherine countered. "It's reality. People don't hate us because we struggle. They hate us because we pretend we don't." She laid out her strategy. They would not confirm the specific dying inside, quote, but they would not deny the emotional strain. They would release a statement that acknowledged challenges but emphasized commitment. It was a masterstroke of PR strategy, turning a humiliating leak into a relatable human struggle. This was the moment Catherine stopped being just the prince's wife and became a political player in her own right. She understood something William didn't. The public would forgive a struggling couple. They would not forgive a fake one. The debate raged for another hour. William was torn between the instinct to protect his privacy and the realization that his wife was right. Silence would create a vacuum that rumors would fill. Controlling the narrative required them to step into the fire. Finally, exhausted and backed into a corner, William agreed to the strategy. But with one condition: we do this together. We frame it as a challenge we are overcoming, not a ship that is sinking. Catherine nodded. It was a fragile agreement, born of necessity rather than unity, but it marked the death of the Queen's old motto. The era of never explain was over. The era of managed vulnerability had begun. And as they drafted the wording that would soon flash across news screens globally, Catherine knew she was gambling the entire reputation of the future monarchy on one simple belief: that the truth wouldn't kill them. At 9:43 p.m. on Saturday night, the embargo lifted, and the dam finally broke. The first notification lit up on phones across London, then New York, then Sydney. It started with a royal correspondent known for impeccable sources, who tweeted a headline that was understated yet devastating. "Wales marriage under strain. princess reportedly struggling with isolation. Within 60 seconds, the dam didn't just break, it evaporated. The internet did what it does best. It took a nuanced tragedy and turned it into a global spectacle. The headline wasn't just read, it was dissected, memed, and broadcast across every platform from TikTok to CNN. The hashtag number Kate Middleton trended globally in under 11 minutes, surpassing breaking news about wars and elections. Inside Kensington Palace, the communications team watched the monitors in stunned silence. They had prepared for a storm, but they were witnessing a tsunami. At 10 p.m., exactly as Catherine had strategized, the palace released the official statement. It was short, drafted with agonizing precision, to thread the needle between honesty and dignity. The Prince and Princess of Wales have faced challenges in their marriage, as many couples do. They remain committed to their family and to their duties, and ask for understanding as they navigate this private period. It was a historic document. Never before had the palace officially confirmed marital strife, while the marriage was still intact. It was the managed vulnerability gamble in action, and the world's reaction was immediate and violently divided. The public response split effectively into two warring camps, revealing the deep generational fracture in how the monarchy is viewed. The traditionalists were horrified. On morning television shows and in the comment sections of the Daily Mail, the old guard viewed Catherine's confession and the subsequent confirmation as a betrayal of the Queen's legacy. They called it Americanized psychobabble. They argued that a future queen does not have the luxury of loneliness. She knew what she signed up for. One prominent columnist wrote, "Duty is not about happiness, it is about endurance. By admitting weakness, she has cheapened the crown." But the modernists and the silent majority reacted differently. For millions of women who had watched Catherine perform perfection for 20 years, the admission was electrifying. They didn't see weakness, they saw validation. The phrase, "dying inside," resonated with anyone who had ever felt trapped in a relationship or a job that demanded their soul. Social media was flooded with support. "Finally, she is real," read one viral tweet. "If the most privileged woman in the world can feel lonely, maybe it's okay that I do too." Catherine's gamble was working, but at a terrible cost. The narrative had shifted from royal scandal to human tragedy. She was no longer just a mannequin, she was a protagonist. But for Prince William, watching the coverage from the dim light of his living room, the feeling was not relief. It was nausea. He saw his private life being debated like a spectator sport. He read comments speculating on his temper, his coldness, his fitness to be king. He realized that while Catherine might be winning the battle for public sympathy, he was losing the battle for his reputation. The statement had saved them from looking like liars, but it had stripped them of their armor. They were no longer the untouchable gods of Olympus. They were just a husband and wife, exposed and bleeding in the public square, waiting to see if their subjects would offer a hand or throw another stone. Sunday morning dawned over London with a gray, relentless drizzle, the kind of weather that feels like a hangover after a night of chaos. Inside the walls of Kensington Palace, the phones had finally stopped ringing, but the silence was arguably worse than the noise. William and Catherine sat together in the breakfast room, a space that had hosted thousands of perfect, happy family meals. But today, the air was different. The newspapers were spread out on the table, their headlines screaming variations of the same truth. The tears behind the Tiara and Kate, the lonely princess. For the first time in 20 years, they weren't hiding. The crisis had forced a reckoning. By confirming the challenges in their marriage, they had destroyed the illusion of perfection that William had fought so hard to maintain. The fairy tale of the commoner who married the prince and lived happily ever after was officially dead. It had been killed by a trembling hand over a teacup and a midnight press statement. But in its place, something else was beginning to emerge. William looked at his wife, really looked at her not as a consort to be managed, but as a partner who had just pulled them back from the brink of disaster. He apologized, not the formal apology of a prince, but the quiet apology of a husband. He apologized for the distance, for the control, for allowing the machinery of the crown to crush the humanity out of their home. Catherine accepted it, but with a caveat. The rules had changed. The old deal where she suffered in silence to protect his image was over. They agreed to therapy, not just for the sake of the marriage, but for the sake of the monarchy. They agreed to prioritize their relationship over the relentless schedule of duties. It was a fragile truce. The marriage was broken, yes. The cracks were visible to the whole world now. But as the Japanese art of kintsugi teaches, sometimes the object is stronger where it has been broken and repaired with gold. Upstairs, the children were waking up. George, Charlotte, and Louis would walk into a world today that looked different than it did yesterday. They would grow up knowing their parents were flawed. They would see headlines about struggle, not just triumph. And perhaps, William realized, that was a good thing. Perhaps George wouldn't have to carry the suffocating burden of perfection that had nearly destroyed his father and grandmother. As the day began, the public mood shifted from shock to a strange kind of respect. The comments online were no longer just gossiping, they were rooting for them. By showing their wounds, William and Catherine had become human. The crisis of the last 24 hours hadn't toppled the monarchy. Instead, it had reset it. The fairy tale is dead. Long live the reality. We are witnessing the beginning of the real era of the House of Windsor. It will be messy, it will be complicated, it will be painful. But for the first time in a long time, it will be honest. And as Catherine looked out the window at the grey London sky, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't lonely anymore. The world knew her truth. The mask was gone. And even if the future was uncertain, at least she was finally facing it as herself.